Story 1.
Snow. Snow everywhere. Antarctica, an endless expanse of ice. White expanses of glaciers. Frozen mountains and plains. So white that the reflected sunlight almost blinds. And there's absolute silence here. Penguins and wild animals nest along the coasts, leaving the interior of the continent completely lifeless. I shuddered and woke up. The familiar sounds of snow crunching and the vibrations of the Haggins BV 206 reassured me that everything was okay, and the tracked vehicle was speeding towards its destination. Yet for some reason, I felt a deep sense of unease. I got up from my place and headed towards the pilot's cabin. On the way, I passed by Lily, who was running diagnostics on the auxiliary control panel, and Billy, who was fussing with his rifle in the cargo hold. My model of Haggins BV 206 is a modified version, significantly larger in size and equipped with separate cabins for various purposes. Thanks to my achievements in science and my position as an officer in the Military Research Center in Antarctica, I was able to acquire this multifunctional transport for scientific work. I was proud of my Haggins BV 206 model, as I had been involved in its development. Reaching the front of the vehicle, I silently looked through the armored windshields at the white wall of a snowstorm enveloping this boundless world. Of course, I could simply access the external camera feeds from the command center, but I trusted my own eyes much more. Everything seemed to be in its place. I hesitated for a few moments, then turned to the driver, Joe. Did something just happen? The young man looked at me puzzled. No. Oh, a few minutes ago, the instruments detected a slight spike in seismic activity, but I was warned that this happens regularly in this area. Don't worry, sir, we'll reach the station in about half an hour. All right, but keep an eye out, I said, frowning. I returned to my cabin, poured myself a cup of coffee, and then headed to the command center. Lily, contact the research laboratory. Tell them we'll be arriving soon. She paused her diagnostic work, activated the transmitter, and sent a request to connect to the facility we were approaching. For several minutes, there was only static on the channel. Lily furrowed her brow, then repeated the call, extending the communication antennas to their full length. Still nothing. I took a sip of coffee. What? Is no one answering? She studied the monitors, then said uncertainly, No, it's not that. It's just... It seems our signal isn't getting through for some reason. I scratched the back of my head. Then contact the Army Command. Ask them for updated information on the status of the facility. Lily did as instructed, but there was still no response. Her face darkened slightly. Sir, I also can't establish communication with the Army Command. It seems all communication channels are down. I remained silent for a few moments. Lately, establishing a stable connection had become somewhat more difficult, but we had never experienced a complete communication blackout. Does this mean we're completely cut off from everyone? Is it because of the snowstorm? Lily hesitated. I can't say, sir. A regular snowstorm shouldn't disrupt the signal this badly. It's probably a malfunction. The chief engineer mentioned something about needing to replace old parts in the transport's communication block. That doesn't sound very good, I said, rubbing my temple. My innate acute sense was troubling me. I remained vigilant for the remainder of the journey. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. After half an hour sitting in the pilot's cabin, I noticed the research facility. The structure looked more like a small fortress town than a scientific base. It was dangerously close to the ocean shore, surrounded by a thick wall with powerful towers aimed at the dark waves. A large dome-shaped structure, painted white against the black sky, towered over the formidable fortress. It resembled a gigantic, perfectly smooth egg. The facility didn't have an official name. It was simply known as BIO-4. Like many similar centers, it conducted research in the field of climate change. However, given that the facility was also guarded by a military garrison, I assumed secret research was conducted here as well. Joe, slow down and be cautious. We gradually decreased speed as we approached the settlement. The lights of the Haggins BV 206 soon illuminated a small park of vehicles parked in front of the building, apparently waiting to evacuate personnel. For a moment, I felt a twinge of fear. The entire facility seemed empty, inhabited only by ghosts roaming its streets. However, then powerful floodlights on the wall lit up, cutting through the snow and flooding the surroundings with bright light. We drove up to the vehicle parking area and parked nearby. At that moment, the heavy gates of the fortress opened, and a lone human figure emerged into the blizzard. With a sigh, I opened the vehicle's door and stepped out into the cold. I approached closer and scrutinized the stranger. The man was tall, strong, appearing to be about 40 years old. He was dressed in black thermal wear, similar to what I wore, over which he had an unzipped parka. He had dark hair and calm, intelligent eyes. His stern and tired face was set in an impassive expression. Overall, everything about the stranger spoke of experience and discipline. I stopped a few steps from him, saluted in accordance with military protocol, and said, "I'm Captain Andrew Stanley, here to assist with the evacuation of personnel, as well as the transportation and preservation of scientific research data. You were supposed to be informed of our arrival." The tall man lingered for a few moments, studying me, then nodded in response. "I'm Captain David Foster." He extended his hand to me and said in an even voice, "Welcome to BIO-4. We entered the fortified settlement, grateful for the opportunity to take shelter from the snowstorm behind its thick walls. There, we saw groups of soldiers patrolling the area between the buildings. They all looked tense and tired. Captain Foster led us deeper into the complex, sidestepping the central dome-shaped structure. His walk was firm and confident. Under my command are about 100 military personnel. We are protecting over 50 scientists and civilian staff members. Until recently, everything was going well. But as you can imagine, right now we're all eager to get away from the ocean." I raised an eyebrow. "Everything was going well?" Foster grimaced. "Yes. We were conducting research deep in the ocean when suddenly there was a series of intense seismic activities, leading to earthquakes and a shift in the ice cover. Several icebergs broke off from glaciers and ice shelves, and valuable divers were lost at ocean as a result. It's unknown what's causing these still recurring natural phenomena, but now the ocean is rising beyond its shores. It would be best for us to leave the station." He paused for a moment, then asked, "What's the situation at the center?" Command took quite a while to respond. "Frankly, I expected more substantial assistance. No offense, Captain Stanley." I shrugged. "In the center, it's business as usual. Too many tasks, too few specialists, excessive bureaucracy, and a lack of budget and time. Changes are happening all across Antarctica. Politicians are increasingly discussing the topic of natural resources, and we're on the verge of open competition, a fight for control over this continent. It's clear that the military presence here will only grow and strengthen, officially in support of scientific projects, of course. Command understands this, so their main focus now is to stay as close to leadership as possible. In such an atmosphere, the problems of a small laboratory are pushed to the background, or even further. Please don't take it personally, Captain Foster." He stopped and looked at me with a somber expression. "You're quite straightforward, Captain Stanley. I think we'll make a good team. What do you plan to do first?" I scratched the back of my head and said, "I need to report to command about my arrival at the facility." The communication system in my transport is down. You've lost contact with command too? Yes. What? You too? Are you also cut off from the Army network? Captain Foster was silent for a second, then nodded. All communication stopped about an hour ago. At this moment, we have been unable to establish a new connection. I could reluctantly admit that due to a minor malfunction, my masterpiece of engineering thought, the Haggins BV 206, lacked the capability to break through the growing field of interference enveloping Antarctica. However, a facility like BIO-4 was supposed to have an extremely powerful communication system, if even they couldn't connect to the outside world. Something's not right here. I couldn't explain the reason for the sudden communication blackout, but the consequences of not being able to communicate with Army Command were extremely unpleasant. Upon arrival at the destination, I was supposed to receive further instructions. I looked at Foster. This is really strange. No offense, but a remote research center in the middle of nowhere, suddenly losing touch with the outside world. It's all a bit eerie. This disconnection has nothing to do with what the scientists are working on here, does it? Captain Foster smiled. I understand why you might think that. However, I want to assure you that the research conducted in this laboratory is absolutely safe. I myself am partly a scientist, but the work done here is mostly theoretical. Of course, there are also practical experiments, but they are all under strict control, ruling out any possibility of unforeseen situations. The worst that can happen is someone making a mistake in an electronic spreadsheet and getting a scolding from the old man. He seemed sincere enough to me. Well, if you say so. The old man you mentioned, is he an important person whom I need to take to safety? Captain Foster nodded. Yes, the chief researcher. He's a bit eccentric, but his intentions are good, at least in most cases. I was just about to introduce you to him. Then lead the way. We entered an elevator and descended underground. Soon I found myself in a spacious room that resembled a lecture hall. There, an elderly man in a white lab coat was discussing something with a young assistant. Foster cleared his throat, drawing his attention. Professor, this is Captain Stanley. He has been sent to assist with the evacuation. He is also personally responsible for your safety. Foster looked at me and added, Captain, this is the chief researcher of Bio-4, Professor Brandon Miller. The man in front of me was a rather well-known scientist in certain circles. He was about 80 years old, or even older. His skin was as thin as paper, under which knotted blue veins were clearly visible, and his neatly groomed hair was completely white. However, the old man's eyes still shone with a sharp intellect. I hesitated for a moment. Professor Miller, I'm truly honored to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you and your work. The old man smiled. You know who I am, Captain? How flattering. It's nice to see that the younger generation still values such little-known scientists as myself. His assistant, a young woman with dark hair tied in a bun, smirked. Indeed. I thought all military personnel only know how to boast about their weapons. I gave her an impassive look. For your information, I'm also a researcher, and I've taught at a military academy for several years. Several scientific papers have been published under my name. Professor let out a good-natured chuckle. Don't be so harsh, Vivian. In any case, then we are in your care, Captain Stanley. What now? Are we leaving the laboratory? Vivian frowned and looked towards the other end of the hall, where many scientists were busy copying data onto external storage devices and anxiously scurrying back and forth. I shook my head. We can't contact the Central Command right now, so it's hard to say. There will be news once we re-establish communication. It may take some time, but much depends on the information we receive. We might still be delayed." The young woman, Vivian, sighed with relief. "Ah, great. I was afraid we'd have to leave much of the data behind. We'll continue preparing for departure then." Professor Miller watched his assistant walk away and sighed. "Don't mind Vivian, Captain. We're all a bit on edge these days." I shrugged. "I understand. The situation is indeed difficult." Outside, the snowstorm still raged on the continent, immersing reality in a murky white haze. In such weather, it was easy to fall asleep and freeze to death. Passing along some structure, I hurried into the building where the sleeping quarters were located. A few hours had passed since my arrival at the station. Soon, my subordinates were supposed to restore communication. Honestly, I was eager to leave this place. As I entered the building, my subordinate Billy met me, and together we headed to the recreation room. "How did your meeting with the professor go, sir?" he asked. "We had an interesting conversation. He's a remarkable man," I replied. "He definitely needs to be brought to a safe place." "The weather concerns me, sir," Billy said grimly, looking out the window. "And this station, I don't know why, but it feels eerie to me. Do we really have to wait for directives from the leadership?" As I was about to respond, my assistant Lily entered the room and interrupted me. "Captain, sir, it's all very bad." The situation is still not entirely clear, but there has been a series of earthquakes. The road and some bridges have collapsed. Deep cracks have appeared all over the southern quadrant. But the worst part is that a disaster occurred at our main base. Central Command has suffered. Some of them are trapped under the rubble. I managed to speak with Colonel Richardson, but then the connection was lost again. What about our orders? What does Command want us to do? Did the Colonel manage to convey anything? Lily sighed. The area between this station and the nearest base is deemed too dangerous to cross. The entire Antarctic center has been affected, but its southern outskirts seem to have suffered the most. So, we can't return. The previous evacuation plan has been canceled. From the look on Billy's face, I could tell he was on the verge of uttering curses, so I swore instead. "Damn, what now? Are we just supposed to stay here and wait for the ocean to swallow us?" Lily shook her head. "We've received new orders, sir. Since evacuation by land currently seems impossible, a naval convoy will be rerouted to us. If all goes well, it will reach us in 2 to 3 weeks. We are ordered to wait for its arrival." Billy sighed gloomily and anxiously said, 3 weeks in this eerie laboratory, but it should be doable." I too was not thrilled, as I disliked traveling aboard ships. Being locked in a metal transport in the middle of the ocean, the thought of it was not too appealing. But on the other hand, crossing hundreds of kilometers of treacherous terrain with soldiers and civilians, without reconnaissance data from command, amid natural disasters happening here and there, seemed like an even worse idea. I had to admit there were no other options. "Understood. I guess we've arranged ourselves a little vacation. Billy, relay this news to Captain Foster. Lily, start preparing. And I need to meet with Professor Miller." As Billy left the room, the assistant approached me and said, "Sir, I also need to tell you that before the connection was lost, Colonel Richardson said something strange." From her tone, I could tell she was hesitant. However, Lily continued, "The Colonel added that our base was attacked by, some flying entities." "What? Attacked? Entities?" I didn't understand. "Yes, to be more precise, it seemed to me that Colonel Richardson said, monsters. Flying monsters." "Ah, monsters? Are you sure?" "No, sir. There was interference on the line, so I'm not certain." It was strange to hear such a thing, and the expression on Lily's face indicated that she was not lying and was also confused. But what was worse, my heightened sense was sounding an alarm. Maybe our main base really was in a situation beyond conventional threats. I pondered for a moment and decided to set this question aside for now. We need to restore communication with the center, prioritize solving this problem. Talk to Captain Foster. Maybe he can help, I said. Lily saluted and left the room, leaving me in somber thoughts. Considering we were to spend at least 2 weeks at the research center, I instructed my subordinates to make themselves at home. My Haggins BV 206 was brought within the fortress walls, and we decided to use it as living quarters instead of settling in one of the buildings. Bio 4 was a large facility and offered us many opportunities to entertain ourselves and pass the time. We could eat in the dining hall, relax in one of the game rooms, or even visit a small library. Several days passed in relative calm. We failed to re-establish communication, and we were clueless about what was happening on the continent. It was troubling, but what could we do in such a situation? I watched the black waves crash and retreat, licking the rocky shore near the high wall of the fortress. I had developed a habit of coming here once or twice a day, perhaps in hope of seeing the naval convoy. Of course, it was foolish, as their arrival was days away. Nevertheless, every time I watched the waves, I fell into a contemplative mood. Days went by, a week passed, then another, but there was no sign of the naval convoy. With each day, the situation at the station worsened. The water was rising, and we understood that we couldn't stay here much longer. However, I couldn't disobey the command's orders, and neither could Captain Foster. We continued to wait. Then, one morning, which was no different from the evening, a familiar figure of Captain approached my transport. "David? What happened?" Foster looked up and was silent for a few moments. Dark circles lay under his calm, tired eyes. "Yes, something happened," he said. Taking a deep breath, the captain continued, "One of my soldiers has gone missing. The missing soldier vanished from his quarters in the middle of the night. His absence was noted in the morning when he failed to report for his duty. He was one of the experienced soldiers on track to becoming an officer. Being late was out of character for him. On the way to the barracks, I started asking the obvious questions. Did you search the facility?" The captain nodded. "Yes, in all the places he could have had access to. There are no traces of him anywhere." "What about the surveillance cameras? Did they record anything?" Foster clenched his teeth, then shook his head. "Most of the surveillance system was knocked out during the snowstorm. What little remains is practically useless due to interference. There are no recordings we could use." We arrived at the barracks and proceeded to the missing soldier's personal room, in front of which a few people were already gathered with worried expressions on their faces. Entering, I felt my unease growing because there was nothing there. Nothing in the small room indicated that something had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no drops of blood, no unusual smells in the air. It was as if the soldier had indeed somehow vanished into thin air. After a while, I looked at Foster and asked a somewhat awkward question. Could he have deserted? The captain stared at me uncomprehendingly. Where would he go? Even if someone went mad and decided to flee from the remote station, there was nowhere to go. Foster added, "I was hoping you might notice something I missed. Did you find anything?" "No, nothing." The entire facility was combed through by the garrison's soldiers. Foster even decided to open up the dome of the old observatory. But inside, there was nothing but old equipment, darkness and dust. Then, the captain sent soldiers to comb the coastal plains outside the fortress, but no traces were found. A sense of unrest spread throughout the isolated fortress. And while people crowded together in the game rooms or rest areas to relieve tension, I, Foster, and Professor Miller gathered in the security center for an emergency meeting. There are two possibilities. First, he may have genuinely deserted. Perhaps the soldier did go mad due to isolation. It happens, especially when you know you're cut off from the rest of the world, I suggested. David just shook his head. There was no hostility or readiness to defend in his gesture, as the captain was not one of those leaders who doubt their people or themselves. He didn't have that fragile pride that would make this statement sound offensive. It's highly doubtful. I knew this soldier well. He was a resilient man. Nonetheless, that would be the better outcome. Since the second option, to put it mildly, is more problematic. It entails that the soldier was killed by another person. The killer then disposed of the body and erased any traces of the crime. Considering it's not easy for an ordinary person to kill a trained, experienced soldier, the most likely suspect would be one of your own people, David. Professor Miller sighed heavily. Do we need to continue this conversation? Without traces or clues, it's all futile. Captain Foster, I know you trust your people, but you should conduct an internal investigation. And you, Andrew, the professor turned to me. I would ask you to take your tracked monster and circle the area again to look for any traces. Maybe something will turn up farther from the facility. That sounds like a plan. However, what happens if none of us find anything? David wondered. Then we just have to wait for the naval convoy to arrive and hope that no one else disappears, I replied. The people locked inside the facility were already tense and exhausted, but the new unknown threat made their mood even darker and more unstable. Many held on because of the hope for the imminent arrival of the military ship. And as the search continued, new safety protocols were implemented. Civilians and scientists were prohibited from staying alone, and a system of mutual accountability was created. Living quarters were equipped with additional sensors and alarm locks. Many soldiers were pulled from the walls to strengthen internal patrols and ensure compliance with protocols. To my disappointment, I couldn't find any traces. Foster also discovered nothing. Several more days passed. I was in the Haggins BV 206 when David came to me. He looked at me with a clouded expression and said in a somber voice, 3 more people have disappeared. And not a single new clue was found. One of them was a soldier, another a scientist, and the third a member of the civilian auxiliary staff. They had nothing in common, no thread that tied them together or to the first victim. All 3 vanished from different places, and they were last seen at different times. Captain Foster and I investigated all the residential areas and sections of the facility they frequented, but again found nothing. We need to conduct internal investigations again, interview witnesses and all that. You don't mind if I take the lead on this, do you? I said wearily. David glanced at me sideways. Do whatever is necessary, I'll help. But what concerns me most right now is the panic at the station. I trust my people, of course. Even tired and in isolation, they'll remain disciplined. However, civilians are a different matter. They could become problematic. And the best way to solve this problem is to prevent it from arising. For that, we need to understand what's happening and prevent any more disappearances. Easier said than done, I said. With those words, we moved on to the next agenda item, interviewing witnesses. According to the previously introduced safety protocol, everyone at the station was assigned a buddy. No staff member was to be left alone under any circumstances. The interviews revealed nothing substantial. The mutual accountability buddies of the 3 victims said the same thing. The disappeared were with them throughout the day but vanished at some point, completely unnoticed. The scientist and the civilian staff member disappeared by the time their partners woke up, and the soldier seemed to vanish when his comrade turned away to service one of the wall cameras. Only after the remaining soldier reported his partner's absence did it emerge that 2 more people had disappeared. None of the 3 victims behaved strangely or showed any anxiety before vanishing. We simply had nothing to grasp to unravel the mystery. "We're just spinning our wheels," David spat out angrily. The captain looked tired but still collected and determined. I leaned back in my chair, tiredly thinking about a soft bed. "We're powerless now, but we need to take additional security measures." Foster grimaced. "If the 2 of us feel helpless, how do the others feel? When is the naval convoy arriving?" I silently shook my head. "You know what happened at Central Command. I have big doubts that the ship will arrive in the coming days. Better to prepare for the worst." Soon after, Captain Foster made a statement confirming the importance of the updated safety measures and ordered all station personnel to follow them precisely, and introduced even stricter mutual accountability measures. People were forced to always stick together, log their arrivals and departures in special ledgers, share cramped living spaces, and be confined to areas of the settlement related to their direct duties. They couldn't even go to the bathroom by themselves. Despite all this, 4 more people vanished the next day. There were still no traces. It seemed that the killer, whomever it might be, didn't care whether a person was alone or in a group. The mutual accountability system was not working. Everyone was scared. The following day, 7 people disappeared. 4 of them were experienced soldiers, and the other 3 were scientists. The day after that, 5 more people were gone. No clues were found, and fear continued to spread through the facility like a plague. It hadn't yet turned into panic, but the inhabitants of BIO-4 had already begun to show signs of distress, finding themselves in a suffocating atmosphere of horror, fatigue, and doubt. That evening, I stood on the southern wall of the station, looking at the turbulent black ocean. The cold waves lapped at the stone surface of the beach, carrying bits of ice with them. The wind howled, and the full moon shone in the dark sky, surrounded by an unearthly red glow. After a while, a clumsy figure climbed up the wall and approached me. Billy looked as tired as everyone else, but he was holding up comparatively well. "Captain, I have an idea. May I share it?" I nodded silently. Billy hesitated for a few moments, then said, "Well, it's about the bodies. By now, we've searched every inch of this facility. We've also thoroughly searched the coastal plains. You've probably combed through it all countless times. And yet we haven't found a single drop of blood. It seems we've looked everywhere, but in reality, there's one place we haven't searched. Since the bodies are nowhere else, they must have been in this place, in the water. It's the only logical conclusion." Billy finished speaking and leaned on the wall's edge. The black waves continued to churn, indifferent to his words. The inscrutable ocean remained unchanged. I was silent for a while, then nodded. "Yes, I've thought the same, so I'll keep a close watch on the beach." Billy nodded, lingered for a few moments, then left. I continued to watch the ocean. I thought, this doesn't make sense. Even if the killer is disposing of the bodies by throwing them into the water, someone would have noticed something by now. Dozens of people have already disappeared. All of this is very strange. As I pondered, 2 more people climbed up to the wall. One was a soldier, and the other was a scientist. I turned and looked at them with a bewildered expression. Since I was standing close to the ladder, the newcomers had no choice but to confront me. I remained motionless for a few seconds, then stepped back, giving them way. The soldier and the scientist calmly approached the edge of the wall, climbed over it, and jumped down. One of them landed successfully, but the other hit the rocks and fell silently. The wind carried the disturbing sound of breaking bones. I rubbed my face, continuing to study the ocean. The soldier headed towards the waves while the scientist crawled. Gradually, the icy water reached the soldier's knees, then his waist, then his chest. Finally, he disappeared under the wavy black surface and drowned. At this time, the scientist had crawled far enough to reach the water's edge. His figure also silently dissolved into the cold waves. Nothing remained of the two of them. Standing atop the wall, I continued to watch the ocean calmly. Huh? What was I thinking about? Ah, yes. It is strange that no one had seen anything. How did the bodies get dumped into the ocean without anyone noticing? I continued my contemplation. Maybe my theory was wrong and the killer wasn't using the water to hide the bodies. The water certainly looked inviting. Suddenly, I felt a strange desire to swim, but I came to my senses in time. A swim? What am I, crazy? Who swims in the freezing water during the winter in Antarctica of all places? I said to myself, and shaking my head, continued to watch the beach until I noticed nothing suspicious. Another 2 days passed, during which 5 more people disappeared. Despite increasingly strict security measures, David couldn't prevent the disappearances. It was all in vain. All this time I continued to come to the southern wall, silently watching the ocean. Something bothered me as I looked at the dark waves, and my keen intuition suggested I was close to unraveling the terrible mystery of the disappearances. Hearing light footsteps, I looked back and saw Vivian, shivering from the cold, approaching me. "Hi, what are you doing? You've been hanging on this wall for several days," she said. "I'm conducting an investigation." Vivian stared at me in disbelief. You're doing nothing, and think I'll believe that all this is part of an investigation? Both you and Captain Foster have been completely useless. So many people have disappeared, and neither of you could find the slightest clue. At that moment, another person appeared on the wall. It was a mature woman in a white lab coat with a calm expression on her face. We stepped aside to let her pass, not paying attention as the woman silently climbed over the edge and jumped down. Her eyes reflected the wavy darkness of the ocean. I frowned slightly, hearing the sound of a body hitting the rocks below, and shook my head, instantly forgetting about it. "Believe what you want." Vivian glanced at me for a while, then sighed and turned away. "Sorry. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We just need to hold on for a few more days until help arrives. But you promised to protect the professor. Instead, you're sitting on this wall. That's unacceptable." Gods, how dedicated can she be? The professor that... Can't this girl think about herself for once? She's in danger too. I rolled my eyes. Who said I left him alone? My subordinates Joe and Bill are with the professor. They've been watching over you and the professor 24 hours a day, every day, since all this chaos started. At that moment, another person climbed to the top of the wall and jumped down. Vivian opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. After a long pause, she finally managed to squeeze out a few words. "Well, okay. Then I guess I'll go." Suddenly, she stopped and looked at the ocean. She furrowed her brows. These dark waves should have swallowed this station long ago. Sometimes it seems to me that the ocean is playing with us. At that moment, I was struck as if by lightning. "What? What did you just say?" Vivian looked at me, puzzled, and repeated, It seems to me that the ocean is playing with us." "No, I'm not asking about that. What does it mean that the waves should have swallowed us, swallowed the station, all the same things that were already known? Have you forgotten? Due to seismic activity, the ocean is rising beyond its shores. We were supposed to leave the station. It's just strange that we're still alive. It feels like... What? What was I talking about? What? Why? Vivian stopped speaking and stood as if petrified. Then she looked at the ocean again. She climbed over the fence and jumped down. I heard the crunch of bones and silently watched as the young woman crawled to the dark waves. She drowned. The moon was gone, but I still stood on the wall, watching the ocean. Suddenly, tears streamed down my face, and I felt a pain in my chest. I didn't understand my feelings, but it seemed very sad, desolate, as if I had lost someone dear to me. What's happening? Why am I crying? Why does it hurt so much? Why do my instincts keep screaming about mortal danger? I rubbed my neck and saw blood on my hand under the streetlight. Suddenly, I had a severe headache and lost consciousness. In a feverish dream, I heard Professor Miller's voice. "We're tired. Even sleep doesn't help. I always wondered why. Now I understand. It's too late. But listen, child, I'll inject you with a serum. Maybe it can. If you feel better, convince Captain Foster to take this medicine. He refused me, doesn't trust. But that's all I can do to help. Unfortunately, I understood too late, and saw those creatures too late. I woke up in a ward where light softly seeped through the blinds, enveloping the room in semi-darkness. My head was heavy, and my body felt as if it was cast from lead. For a moment, I couldn't remember what had happened to me and how I ended up here. Trying to gather my thoughts, I cautiously propped myself up on my elbow, feeling weakness in every muscle. Looking around, I realized I was in the station's infirmary. Pristine white walls, a bed with an adjustable headrest, a bedside table with a pitcher of water and a glass. In the corner of the room, a medical monitor blinked, rhythmically displaying my health indicators. I noticed a white envelope on the table next to me. I tried to get up, but my head spun and I fell back onto the pillow. I had to admit I was too weak, but I still managed to grab the envelope. It contained a letter from Professor Miller. It had just a few lines with a strange message. "Soon I won't be here anymore. They've realized that I can see them. Just don't give yourself away. Pretend you don't notice them." When I felt a bit better, I got out of bed and slowly approached the door of my ward. The corridor was silent, broken only by the faint humming of the ventilation. Exiting the room, I was faced with a reality that seemed like a nightmare. Terrifying creatures hovered above the station, monsters that resembled giant bats, but with even more sinister features. Their bodies were hairless, and through their translucent skin, red-blue veins were visible. They looked like vampires from children's horror stories, but the screeching of their wings was too real to be considered fiction. Finally, it all came to me. I pieced together the details in my head and realized how wrong I had been in my foolish speculations. Quickly dressing, I rushed towards the security center. I urgently needed to find Captain Foster. As I walked through the settlement, many people looked at me. Some appeared scared, some angry, but all were very weary, emaciated and pale. Why hadn't I noticed these changes before? The monsters continued to hover above the station, and no one but me seemed to see them. Following Professor Miller's advice, I tried to act as if I didn't notice the flying bloodsuckers overhead. I saw how these creatures occasionally descended to lone victims, touching their necks, and every time they flew back up, the people's faces became even paler and more worn. Arriving at the security center, I found Foster sitting silently with a grim, tired expression. He looked very fragile and pale. I sat opposite him, rubbed my hands to warm them, and asked, "Where's the professor?" Edward silently looked at me, and from his gaze, I understood that I had failed the mission, and Miller was no longer among the living. I looked around. It was just the two of us in the room. All these creatures were outside. I took a deep breath and said, When the first victim disappeared, I said there were only two possibilities: that he had deserted or had been killed by another person. But there was a third option. Right before all this chaos started, my assistant Lily passed on a strange message from my boss. To put it shortly, he told me that flying monsters had attacked the main base. At that time, I didn't pay enough attention to this information. Well, I was wrong. These flying creatures have attacked us too. David frowned at me with a grim reproach. What do you mean? I hesitated a bit before responding. It all becomes obvious if you take two things into account and then put them together. First, the bodies. People don't just vanish without a trace, and yet we found nothing. Not at the station, nor on the coastal plain beyond the wall. Thus, the most obvious answer: the bodies are taken where we can't find them, into the water. After all, there's an entire ocean out there. I'm sure these flying creatures came from the ocean. Captain Foster wanted to say something but eventually fell silent, waiting for me to continue. The second clue or cause of all this chaos is the seismic activity. Perhaps because of earthquakes and colossal fissures across Antarctica, monsters we had not yet seen emerged from the permafrost. I know my words might seem like madness, but it's true. You have to believe me, David. Captain Foster shook his head. All this sounds, to put it mildly, far-fetched. It's very hard to believe, but let's assume you're right, Andrew. However, your theory doesn't fully explain everything. Yes, we pulled many soldiers off the walls to strengthen internal patrols, but the ocean is still being watched. Nothing could have crawled out from under the waves, grabbed people inside the facility, and dragged them back into the water unnoticed. I smiled grimly. Correct. But the problem is that we didn't see them. Our minds, our memories were manipulated. They somehow got into our heads. That's why no one noticed anything. Captain Foster looked at me as if I were insane for a while, then finally asked, "Do you have any proof?" I pulled out the serum that was in the envelope along with the letter from Professor Miller and placed it on the table in front of David. The man gloomily looked at the vial of liquid. "Did the professor inject you with something?" the captain asked me. "Yes." "So you know that I refused him?" David said coldly. "I know. He came to me. I remember his words in fragments, but he said I should persuade you to take this medicine." "What do you think I'll do now?" the captain asked me threateningly. "David, you must understand that I'm not lying. There's horror and total chaos outside. I saw it with my own eyes. I repeat, I'm not lying to you. I've presented you with arguments." "Nonsense," Captain Foster loudly interrupted me. "Everything you've said is just a mad theory from an officer driven insane by isolation." I fell silent, contemplating my next words to convince David. However, the captain spoke again, and his voice was full of anger. "This station, the people in it, everyone who's left, I must protect them. Don't interfere with me, Andrew. Do you understand? If you continue spreading this nonsense, I promise you'll regret it." "All right, Captain Foster, I understand. We'll wait for the naval convoy." I reluctantly replied, realizing that David didn't believe a word I said. "What? What convoy? Did you call for additional military forces to the station?" Captain suddenly asked me. I looked at him in shock. He had forgotten. To be honest, I had almost forgotten why I had come to this facility. But now, what do I do next? I stepped out of the security center and saw one of those creatures approaching me. It flew towards me and clung to my neck. I felt a sharp pain, and at the same time, I was enveloped in a pleasant feeling of warmth. I tried to pretend that I felt nothing and did not notice how my blood was being drained, but it was hard to endure. After a while, the flying monster released me and flew away. I returned to the Haggins BV 206 and saw Billy fiddling with his rifle. Next to him sat Lily, who was working with a diagnostic program on an electronic panel. I thought I needed to pour myself a coffee since I felt very tired. When I returned to my cabin, I accidentally discovered in my pocket a strange letter from some professor and a vial with an unknown liquid. Why am I carrying this with me? I thought, and laid down to rest for a bit.
Story 2.
One day, I received an unexpected notification from a lawyer. Upon meeting him, I was stunned by the news. My late uncle had left me a house. It was so unexpected that I could barely hide my surprise. After all, my uncle and I had never been particularly close. However, besides me, he had no other heirs. My heart was filled with both pity for my departed relative and curiosity about the house that had been passed down to me. After signing all the necessary documents and learning the address, I decided not to go there alone and invited my friends. Mike, my best friend, offered to drive us in his car. I sat in the front seat, while Sarah, my childhood friend, and Thomas, my clumsy but loyal friend, sat in the back. Soon we arrived at the place, and before us stood a mansion forgotten by time. It was an old American house, frozen in the past. Its exterior was impressive, a two-story structure with Victorian features, tall windows framed by faded shutters, and a majestic door with a bronze knocker. The roof was adorned with a curved metal weather vane, which seemed to point the direction to our adventure. Surrounding the house was an ancient garden, where no one had tended to in a long time. Wild bushes intertwined with grapevines and majestic but clearly neglected trees. In the backyard, a small gazebo could be seen, overgrown with moss and ivy, as if inviting us to uncover its secrets. We approached the main door, and Mike, noticing the bronze knocker next to it, cautiously knocked on it, as if expecting someone to answer. The echo of the knock slowly dissipated into silence. Sarah gave him a disapproving look and sighed. Well, let's just go in already. I turned the key in the lock, and with a creak, the door opened slightly. Inside, we were greeted by a cool, dusty air that hadn't felt the presence of living beings for a long time. First, we found ourselves in a spacious hall adorned with antique portraits and heavy curtains, through which the light barely penetrated. The floor was paved with mosaic tiles, the patterns of which depicted intricate geometric figures. To the left was the living room. Inside stood massive leather armchairs facing a fireplace, which had long ceased to have a fire. Shelves with dusty books lined the walls, as if they held forgotten stories of the past. In the corner of the room stood a gramophone, next to it, a stack of old records. Thomas, unable to contain his curiosity, approached it and turned the handle, but only a squeak and silence responded. Next, our path led to the dining room, where a large oak table proudly occupied the center of the room, surrounded by high chairs. Above the table hung a massive chandelier, covered in cobwebs, as if its crystal pendants hadn't emitted light for many years. Beyond the dining room was the kitchen, where antique utensils and dishes were still arranged as if the owners had just left the room. A winding staircase with intricately carved wooden railings led to the upper floor. Upstairs, we were greeted by a long corridor with rows of doors leading to bedrooms. Each room was unique. One concealed a vast library, another an observatory with an ancient telescope pointed towards a faded window. In the last room, which seemed to serve as a study, we found an old writing desk cluttered with old papers. While we explored the upper floors, Mike stayed downstairs, and apparently, his spirit of exploration couldn't be contained. Suddenly, his piercing and excited voice shattered the silence of the old house. prompting us to interrupt our journey into the past. "Come down! You have to see this!" he shouted from the hall. We hurried downstairs, where we found him standing next to a small, inconspicuous door that was well hidden in the shadow under the staircase. He opened the door leading to the basement, and we followed him down the creaky wooden steps, where we were met with a scene straight out of a detective novel. The basement was dimly lit by a bulb hanging from a long wire, giving the room a gloomy yet captivating appearance. The walls were covered with photographs and notes connected by colored threads into a complex web of relationships. At first glance, it resembled a detective's wall, trying to solve a complex case. In the center of the room stood an antique wooden table, piled with stacks of documents, old newspapers, and personal letters, each of which seemed to hold a part of the history of this house and its last owner. There were also several maps on the table, covered with various marks and notes in the margins. In the corner of the room stood a dusty projector and a stack of old slides, which possibly contained additional clues or information. Approaching the wall, I began to examine the photographs carefully. They depicted various places, from serene village views to gloomy corners of a cemetery. One photograph particularly caught my attention, a small but imposing chapel, which seemed shrouded in mystery. Nearby hung various notes, and on one of them I read, "Every 50 years or so, there was such an inscription. The chapel is of significant importance." These words instantly set off a whirlwind of conjectures and assumptions in my mind. My attention shifted to a photograph of a huge statue, whose outlines resembled a person with bat-like wings. The face of the statue, adorned with vampire fangs, looked so realistic that for a moment I caught myself thinking about the skill of the creator of this work. What master could achieve such detail with such precision? I thought to myself. But my thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's voice. She stood at the table, pointing to the map spread out before us. "I know this place," she said, her voice full of confidence. The map showed a forest located at the foot of the mountains, not far from the neighboring town. Recalling local legends, I realized that this forest had always been shrouded in secrets and rumors of unexplained phenomena. As we explored the room, filled with mysteries and untold stories, Mike suddenly suggested, "What if we head there this weekend? We don't have any plans anyway." His suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to all of us, stirring excitement and a desire for adventure. After a short pause, during which each of us weighed the risks and opportunities, Sarah was the first to express her agreement. After her, like dominoes, the rest followed suit. I agreed too, curious as to why my uncle was so interested in this place. Continuing our inspection of the house, we climbed back up to the second floor, where in one of the offices I stumbled upon my uncle's diary. Its antique cover and tattered pages promised to reveal much about the life of the last owner of this mysterious house. This may give us some answers, I thought, putting the diary in my bag to read later in a more tranquil setting. We also took the map, which had become the key to our next adventure. Sunday arrived, the day we had been eagerly awaiting all week. The air was fresh and clean, as if nature itself anticipated our adventures. We agreed to meet at 8 in the morning, and as I sat in the kitchen, enjoying the quiet of the early hours, the sudden honk of a car horn disrupted the peace. Looking out the window, I saw Mike eagerly waving to me, standing next to his car. Grabbing my things, I quickly stepped outside and noticed that everyone was already in place. Among us was a newcomer, Jess, Sarah's friend, who greeted me with her characteristic smile. Sitting in the front seat next to Mike, I surveyed our companions. Everyone was filled with determination and anticipation. We exchanged glances, in which readiness for the impending trials was evident. Mike started the car, and we slowly set off, leaving the familiar streets of our town behind. As the cityscapes outside the car window gave way to wild landscapes, the conversations in the car didn't die down. We discussed everything, from legends and myths associated with the forest at the foot of the mountains to what we hoped to find or decipher. Jess, being a new member of our team, listened to the tales of our recent exploration of my uncle's house with visible curiosity, sometimes asking questions that made us look at already known facts from a new perspective. As the landscapes outside the car window changed, I decided to read my uncle's diary, which was like a portal into his past. Flipping through the pages, I delved into his thoughts, experiences, and suddenly, my attention was drawn to entries about the statue in the forest. My uncle began his story with the words, "I stumbled upon this village completely by accident. After surveying it, I soon realized that it harbored something unusual, a mystery that I was to unravel. My investigation began with the archives, where I discovered that the village had been abandoned about 45 years ago. But it would be more accurate to say that at a certain point, all its inhabitants, about 200 people, simply disappeared without a trace. This discovery shook me to the core. My desire to solve this mystery only intensified. Continuing my work with the archives, I came across a police report, which indicated that real disasters had occurred in the village. The report spoke of clear signs of struggle, of panic that apparently gripped the inhabitants. It was obvious that something terrible had happened here. However, there were no traces of where the residents could have disappeared to, or what exactly had happened. Reading these lines, I felt my heart beating faster. In my uncle's diary, it wasn't just an exploration of an abandoned village, but a real investigation, full of secrets and unsolved mysteries. Continuing to read the diary, I discovered that my uncle, immersing himself in the investigation of the village, gradually uncovered its secrets. He wrote, "As evidence accumulated, it became clear that the village was a haven for cultists who worshipped an ancient deity. Images of this god I found everywhere, only enhancing the atmosphere of mystique surrounding this place. However, the presence of a chapel in the middle of the village became a new puzzle for him. Why, while worshipping another god, did they leave the chapel untouched? He wondered. Deciding to investigate this question, my uncle spent a considerable amount of money on carbon dating, which shed light on the history of the chapel. It turned out that it was several hundred years old and preceded the founding of the village itself. This discovery only added new questions to my investigation, he noted. In his quest to unravel the mystery, my uncle learned about the statue of a deity located deep in the forest not far from the village. The statue inspired awe and respect. Its scale and craftsmanship were truly impressive. It stood there, as if a guardian or a reminder of forgotten vows and faith. Opening the final pages of the diary, I found an entry where my uncle expressed confidence that the disappearance of the village's residents was somehow connected to the statue. "I am certain of this," he wrote, as if leaving us a message from the past. Then followed a description of a meeting with the sole survivor, a young man who in childhood witnessed horrifying events and was now in a psychiatric hospital. According to my uncle, the survivor's condition left much to be desired. He was withdrawn, and his gaze often drifted into emptiness, as if he saw things others couldn't. Attempts to ask about what happened in the village were met with incoherent babbling, from which only fragments about burning red eyes and advice to run to the chapel could be gleaned. The entries abruptly ended, leaving many questions unanswered. Why did my uncle stop his investigations? Looking at the dates in the diary, I was surprised to realize that exactly 50 years had passed since the mysterious events in the village. This number was also noted in the basement. What could it mean? Closing the diary, I leaned back in my seat and tried to make sense of everything I had read. Thoughts swirled in my head about the connection between the disappearance of the villagers, the statue, and the chapel. With every mile, civilization seemed farther and farther away. And the mysterious forest, which my uncle's diary spoke so much about, drew nearer. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed to cease to exist, merging with the dense thickets. Mike carefully parked the car under the canopies of old trees, and we stepped outside. The air here was fresh and cool, saturated with the aromas of the forest and the earth. Gathering the necessary equipment, we entered the forest, leaving the car behind. Making our way through the forest thicket, we tried to navigate by the map we had brought with us. Rustling underfoot, birdsong, and the whisper of leaves merged into a single sound that accompanied us along the way. The sunlight barely reached the ground through the dense tree canopy, creating a mysterious interplay of shadows and light. We walked in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts and expectations of the impending discovery. After an hour of determined progress through the dense forest, we finally stumbled upon our first landmark, a small river, flowing calmly among the trees. Its water was cool and clear, and the banks were covered with soft moss and stones. According to my uncle, we needed to continue our journey along this river to reach the abandoned village. We decided to follow along the riverbank, enjoying the freshness and natural beauty. The sound of water accompanied us, filling our hearts with calmness, and at the same time the anticipation of something unknown. The river meandered among the trees, sometimes widening, sometimes narrowing, but invariably leading us forward, toward the goal of our journey. After walking for some distance, we began to notice changes in the landscape and vegetation. Trees became less dense, and underfoot appeared traces of an old road, overgrown with grass and moss, but still discernible among the forest cover. This was a sign that we were nearing our destination. As we walked suddenly, a sudden rustle from the side of the trail made us freeze in place. The heart pounded in my ears, and silence hung in the air, as if nature itself held its breath. Out of the bushes, a wild boar suddenly darted, and we barely managed to jump aside. The animal didn't look like ordinary members of its species. Its eyes glowed with bright red light, giving it a sinister and unnatural appearance. This sight etched itself into my memory, sending shivers down my spine. Mike reacted first and shouted for us to climb the nearest trees. In his hands he had a spray, apparently pepper spray, which he directed at the raging animal. Without wasting time, we scattered, quickly climbing the nearest branches. Mike stayed on the ground, face to face with the boar. As the enraged beast lunged at Mike, he calmly sprayed a stream of liquid directly into the boar's face and skillfully dodged the attack, then quickly climbed a tree. However, the spray only intensified the boar's rage. With bloodshot eyes, it repeatedly charged at the tree where Mike was hiding, ramming it with its head. We watched this scene, holding our breath, hearts pounding with fear. The animal seemed to feel no pain, its red eyes staring up at Mike. But suddenly, after another blow, the boar weakened. Its legs gave way, and it fell lifeless to the ground, forming a dark pool of blood around itself. The silence, interrupted only by our quickened breaths, once again enveloped the forest. We slowly descended from the trees, surveying the dead boar's body with undisguised horror. Examining the dead boar's body, we tried to find an explanation for its strange behavior. "Maybe rabies?" suggested one of us. But the burning red eyes didn't fit the framework of a typical illness. We exchanged conjectures, but none seemed convincing enough. This incident added darker shades to our adventure, and we cautiously continued our journey, delving deeper into the shadows of the forest. Regaining our composure after the unexpected encounter, we followed along the old road, which, as it seemed to us, should lead us to the abandoned village. Dry leaves rustled underfoot, and around us reigned such silence that it seemed as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of our next move. As we progressed, the landscape began to change. Trees became less dense, allowing more sunlight to penetrate. And then, after an exhausting hour of travel, we finally emerged into a clearing, beyond which lay the place we were seeking. Before us lay the village, like a page from a long-forgotten history book, surrounded by silent forest. Every house, every structure here was shrouded in the veil of time and oblivion. Collapsed roofs, crumbling walls, doorways and windows filled with darkness seemed like portals to another world. Streets overgrown with tall grass and bushes wound between the buildings, creating a labyrinth that held echoes of the past. We moved slowly, carefully stepping on the uneven pavement, still feeling the eyes of unseen witnesses to our actions. The air here was saturated with the scent of antiquity and mold, and the silence was periodically broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant echo of our footsteps. Strange symbols engraved on stones and walls of some houses caught our attention. These signs, described by my uncle in his diary as symbols of an ancient god, were everywhere. They were incomprehensible, but at the same time they inspired awe. Especially one symbol, depicting a circle with rays radiating from the center, caught our attention. This sign, according to my uncle, was the main symbol of the cult worshipping an unknown deity. Trying to decipher the meaning of these symbols and their connection to the village's history, we found an altar in one of the houses. In the center of the ruined room, on a low pedestal, stood a stone covered with the same signs. Nearby on the ground lay candle stubs and pieces of fabric, presumably used in rituals. This place undoubtedly was the center of the cult, a place of worship and sacrifice. Continuing our exploration, we slowly made our way through overgrown streets until we reached the open square in the village center. Before us stood the chapel. Its walls, covered with moss and lichen, distorted with time, and the roof, under the weight of years, partially collapsed, allowing daylight to penetrate inside through the gaps. Approaching closer, we could see that what was once a monumental entrance now resembled more ruins than an invitation to enter. Inside, as expected from a building that had survived so many years of oblivion, there was emptiness and destruction. The air was filled with the smell of decay and earth, and the floor was littered with debris of wood and stone. Doubts about whether anything could have survived inside this ancient chapel seemed entirely reasonable. The interior space was almost emptied. There were no benches for worshippers, no altar, which once perhaps served as the central element of this sacred place. All that remained of its religious purpose were faded frescoes on the walls, barely discernible under layers of dust and cobwebs. Exploring the ruins, we found a small stone fragment under one of the collapsed walls, adorned with faded remnants of carving. This piece of stone, perhaps once part of a larger composition, now served only as a silent reminder of the chapel's former glory. In the back of the chapel was a door leading to a small room, which likely served as a storage for religious artifacts or a residence for the priest. The entrance was blocked by debris, and after some effort we managed to make our way inside. To our surprise, this room contained more than could have been expected, given the condition of the rest of the chapel. Several waterlogged and weathered books lay on the floor, their pages yellowed and crumbling to the touch. However, the texts were unreadable, their secrets lost forever. After exploring the village and the chapel, we found no significant discoveries. My uncle, who spent so many years here, would hardly have missed anything. Impressed by what we had seen, we soon grew hungry and decided to have a snack. We decided to take a short break on the edge of the village, where nature was once again beginning to reclaim its rights over the abandoned human space. From our backpacks, we pulled out thermoses with hot tea and coffee, as well as sandwiches that we carefully prepared the day before. Sitting on the ground, leaning against one of the trees, we enjoyed this simple but much-needed pleasure. As we ate, our gaze constantly wandered over the village landscape, as if trying to imprint every detail in memory. The ruined buildings and overgrown streets under the evening sun took on a particularly mystical appearance, creating a contrast between the beauty of nature and the tragedy of oblivion that had engulfed this place. After eating and resting, we decided to visit the statue that was supposed to be nearby. After walking about half a mile south of the village, we stumbled upon an astonishing sight. Before us stretched a winding path, trodden by numerous feet. It seemed that this place had become frequented, piquing our curiosity. Deciding to explore where this path led, we soon discovered its endpoint, the very statue, surrounded by a crowd of tourists. About 30 people were cheerfully taking photos near it, adding the snapshots to their social media. This place had evidently become a new tourist attraction, perhaps due to someone's post on social media. The crowd was engrossed in the process of taking photographs, taking selfies, and discussing the best angles for shots. We realized that information about the statue had spread very quickly, but it seemed these people were not yet aware of the village, indicating that interest in this attraction had emerged quite recently. As my friends and I approached the statue, we were struck by its extraordinary realism. The statue was crafted with such masterful precision that it seemed as if we were facing not cold stone, but a living creature, suddenly frozen in time. Especially impressive was the statue's face. Its expression was so eerie that it seemed as if it would come to life and look at us any moment. Coming into close proximity, I couldn't tear my gaze away from its eyes, which were carved with such detail that their emptiness seemed bottomless. At that moment, I felt a chill run through my body, causing goosebumps to form on my skin. It wasn't just a sensation of coldness. It was something deeper, something that seemed familiar yet infinitely distant. I felt my attention focus solely on the statue, and everything around began to lose its contours. The sounds of laughter and conversations of tourists around us turned into distant whispers that slowly faded away, leaving me alone with this stone gaze. The world around me seemed to vanish, leaving me in the void between reality and something unknown, calling from the depths of the statue. It seemed to me that time slowed its pace, and breathing became heavier. In my imagination, the statue came to life, and I felt its cold breath on my skin. With each passing second, the feeling of unease grew, and I realized that being so close to the statue, I had entered into an invisible dialogue with it, drawing me deeper into its trance-like horror. At that moment, I felt a light touch from Thomas, who, noticing my state, tried to bring me back to reality. This touch acted like an instant awakening from a nightmare, and I jerked, breaking the invisible connection that held me under the statue's sway. Gradually returning to reality, I realized how powerful the influence of this stone creation was on my consciousness. Suddenly, I felt the need to urgently leave this place. The cawing of crows, arising seemingly out of nowhere, shattered the silence, causing everyone around to freeze and look up. The birds, gathering into a whirl above our heads, created a sense of impending threat. What was clear sky a moment ago was now rapidly filling with heavy, ominous clouds, obscuring the sun and plunging everything into a sinister twilight. These changes were happening so quickly that it became truly frightening. The thought that I might be the catalyst for these events flashed through my mind. Although common sense rejected this idea as absurd, my sixth sense screamed that something more was happening here than just a change in the weather. When thunder suddenly roared, it seemed to confirm my fears. My friends and the tourists, who until that moment had been absorbed in taking photos, now looked around with surprise and concern. Some of them, frightened by this sudden turn of events, began to seek shelter, while others, on the contrary, rejoiced in the unexpected adventure, unaware of the potential danger of these changes. The rising wind quickly turned into a storm, and the sky was illuminated by a flash of lightning, striking directly at the statue. The explosion that followed the strike threw us back, and we fell to the ground. A moment later, coming to my senses, I rubbed my eyes, which had barely adapted after the dazzling light, and looked around at my friends, asking if they were all right. There was no answer. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of something unimaginable. Turning to the statue, I understood the reason for their silence. The statue, which seemed impenetrable and eternal, began to crack. Cracks like lightning bolts spread from its head downwards, covering the entire figure with a web of chips and fissures. Then, as if a shell, a thin layer of stone began to peel off and fall away, revealing something horrifying hidden inside. Underneath the layers of stone, a creature was revealed that bore little resemblance to beings from our world. Its skin was dark, with patches where it seemed blood showed through a thin membrane. Its eyes were two burning coals, full of rage and hunger. Its jaws were lined with razor-sharp teeth, seemingly designed for tearing flesh, with two long fangs protruding from the top. It let out a loud sigh, and its inhale echoed through the surroundings. We also heard a loud thumping, the beating of its heart, which sounded like a drumbeat, filling the air with dread. The creature slowly surveyed its surroundings, its gaze sliding among us as if assessing prey. We stood, petrified with horror. Suddenly, with a powerful sweep, it unfurled its massive wings and took off with furious speed, instantly seizing one of the tourists who lay closest. Its sharp fangs sank into the unfortunate's throat, eliciting a desperate scream that tore through the silence. This scream was the most horrifying thing I had ever heard. It turned into a shriek, and then the man began convulsing, before falling still. The monster continued to drink his blood, and soon, it was evident how the man's body began to wither. His skin tightened, muscles dwindled until only a skeletal frame covered with skin remained. When all that was left of the man was skin and bones, he turned to dust, scattered by the wind. Mike was the first to snap out of it, grabbing my hand and yelling that we needed to run. This shout seemed to awaken us all from paralyzing fear, and we fled, desperately trying to escape the horrifying creature. Another victim's cry echoed behind me, but I dared not look back, focusing all my fear and energy on escape. Breath tore through my chest, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. My friends, Sarah and Thomas, ran alongside me, their faces twisted with fear and determination. Suddenly, I felt something heavy land on top of me, and sharp pain pierced my ear. Glancing back, I saw a crow that had swooped down on us. Their eyes gleamed red like hot coals filled with malice or madness. We tried to fend them off, waving our arms, but the birds were persistent and aggressive. Each struck crow momentarily retreated but then returned with renewed force. Fleeing from the crows was madness. They wouldn't relent, attacking us from the sky, pecking and scratching, leaving bloody wounds on my arms. I kept running until I saw the river ahead, the same one we had come along. Without hesitation, I plunged into the water. Although the river was not deep, about waist high, it provided us with a chance to escape the birds. I heard splashes nearby and with relief realized my friends had followed suit. We submerged ourselves and swam downstream, striving to get as far away from our pursuers as possible. When we finally emerged on the shore, we found that the crows had fallen behind. We were all wet and battered, but fortunately, no one had serious injuries. Everyone tried to catch their breath and recover from the nightmare we had just endured, when suddenly, Sarah screamed in horror, "Where's Jess?" Panic engulfed us all at that moment. We quickly looked around, but Jess was nowhere to be seen. My heart froze with a sense of foreboding. Jess had been with us when we started running, but now she was nowhere near. Perhaps she had fallen behind or tripped while we ran to the river. Confronted with the reality of our situation, we faced a difficult choice. Standing frightened on the riverbank, we realized that going back into the woods to search for Jess could cost us our lives. Thomas was the first to voice aloud what perhaps all of us subconsciously understood. Thomas's words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She was overwhelmed with despair and fear for her friend. We tried to comfort her, but deep down, each of us felt the weight of the situation. Mike, trying to find words of reassurance, said that we had no choice but to hope Jess could survive and find her way to safety on her own. It was a tough decision, but the risk to the entire group was too great, and we couldn't afford to act on emotions. In the end, we decided to go downstream along the river, hoping to find a safe place and possibly help. Every step was difficult for us, as the heaviness remained in our hearts for leaving our friend behind. But at the same time, we understood that our responsibility was to preserve our own lives to have a chance to help Jess in the future. Continuing our journey, we looked around at every rustle and sound, fearing that the monster or crows might be following us. Moving along the riverbank, our attention was suddenly drawn by Thomas's piercing scream. Turning around in fright, we saw him clutching his leg, into which a snake had sunk its fangs. Rushing to his aid, we struggled to pry the snake off, whose eyes glowed ominously red. With some effort, we managed to free Thomas from its grip and destroy the threat, crushing the snake with a stone. Examining the wound, we found ourselves unable to determine if the snake had been venomous. As a first aid measure, we applied a simple bandage to the wound and supported Thomas, continuing our journey. However, it soon became evident that his condition was worsening. His body temperature sharply rose, his gaze became unfocused, and he could barely move on his own. When Thomas eventually collapsed, incapacitated, we realized the seriousness of the situation. Understanding that every minute counted but also recognizing the impossibility of continuing without proper assistance, we decided to make camp. While resting and trying to revive Thomas, an unexpected rustle in the bushes made us tense up. However, to our surprise and relief, Jess emerged from the bushes, our long-lost companion. Seeing her friend, Sarah couldn't contain herself and rushed to her, hugging and apologizing for leaving her behind. Jess, silently shaking her head as if forgiving us, approached and sat next to Thomas. Something about her appearance made me uneasy. Looking into her eyes, I saw red sparks, the same as those of the snake and the creature before. She noticed my fear and smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. Suddenly, a horrifying transformation took place. 2 huge wings sprouted from her back, and she turned into the same monster that had previously terrified us. Before we could react, she sank her teeth into Thomas's neck, sucking the life out of him. We, stunned and frightened, helplessly watched as she did so. Then, overcome with fear, fled without looking back. Glancing back, I cast one last look at the scene of the tragedy and saw only ash, which had once been Thomas, dispersing in the wind. At that moment, I understood how the village residents disappeared and why no bodies were ever found. The creature did not pursue us, as if knowing that we could not escape it. Fleeing through the forest turned into a nightmare that we would never forget. The forest, which had previously seemed like a peaceful refuge, now enveloped us in its dark embrace, becoming a trap from which there seemed to be no escape. Every step on the soft, leaf-covered ground intensified our fear, and the branches of trees, scratching our faces and hands, seemed to try to stop us. The creature that pursued us was the embodiment of our darkest nightmares. Its loud, sharp footsteps and eerie breathing were too close, causing our hearts to beat in time with the rhythm of our frantic flight. Every time it seemed like we had gained a little distance, the wind brought us the sounds of its movements, reminding us that death breathed down our necks. The air in the forest was cold and damp, but our bodies were soaked with sweat from fear and exertion. The moon, shining through the dense canopy of trees, created a dance of shadows on the ground, which confused the mind and made us see the creature in every rustle and movement. Our imagination painted the most horrifying pictures, exacerbating panic and despair. We heard the creature emitting ominous low sounds, resembling loud growls accompanied by hissing that penetrated our souls. These sounds filled the night forest, as if heralding doom, and each of them told us that the creature enjoyed the hunt, that we were mere mice in its trap. At one point, as we crossed a small moonlit clearing, I thought I saw its eyes, two burning red coals in the darkness, watching our every move. This gaze, filled with bloodlust and vengeance, made me realize that hiding from this creature was impossible. Desperation gripped us with every step, but a spark of hope ignited within me as I realized we were nearing the village. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through my mind as I tried to recall any information that could help us survive. Then, a note hanging on the wall in my uncle's house, and the words of the sole survivor from previous monster attacks resurfaced in my memory. They spoke of the chapel. This piece of information seemed to be the key to our salvation. My confidence that the chapel played a crucial role in the creature's history and possibly contained a way to stop it urged me to act swiftly. I exerted all efforts to hasten our pace, and we began to run towards the village with renewed vigor. My friends, noticing the change in my demeanor, also picked up the pace, despite their exhaustion and fear. We tore through the forest like a whirlwind, driven not only by the desire to survive but also by a small glimmer of hope that we would find salvation. As we burst into the village, my heart pounded with fear and hope. The chapel, our last hope, stood right at its center. A menacing roar sounded behind us, a sign that the creature had realized our intentions. I shouted to my friends to hurry, feeling every second was of the essence. Finally, the chapel appeared before us, like a beacon in the darkness. Mike reached the door first, flinging it open and darting inside, followed by Sarah. I, however, ran last, feeling the creature's breath on my neck. In the last moment, realizing I was falling behind, I made a desperate leap forward, feeling the creature grab my leg, which hadn't yet crossed the chapel's threshold. In terror, I screamed as Sarah and Mike firmly grabbed my hands, trying to pull me inside. The struggle was unequal. The creature gripped my leg tightly, and I felt it beginning to drag me back. At that moment, I realized I might not survive. But then I remembered the folding knife in my pocket. With desperation, overcoming the pain, I pulled it out, shouting to my friends to let me go, knowing that my life was the price I was willing to pay for our safety. When they finally let go, I used the moment of surprise to lunge directly at the creature and forcefully stabbed the knife into its eye. With a cry of pain, the creature released me. This was my chance. I recoiled back into the chapel, and the creature, in a rage trying to pursue me, collided with an invisible barrier. It snarled, thrashed, and attempted to break through the protection, but all efforts were in vain. Finally, realizing its powerlessness, the creature relented, and spreading its wings, flew off into the darkness of the night. As night fell, darkness enveloped the chapel, pierced only by distant cries emanating from the depths of the forest. These sounds, sometimes piercing, sometimes mournful, kept us restless, reminding us that danger still lurked nearby. Our phones had no signal, cutting us off from the rest of the world, and we waited for dawn, taking shelter within the walls of the old chapel. Recalling my uncle's investigation and his notes on the creature, I concluded that everything had to end at sunrise the next day. This thought gave us hope, though it didn't promise an easy resolution to our problems. Morning came, but sleep eluded us. We anxiously awaited the first rays of sunlight, which were supposed to dispel the darkness and perhaps our fears along with it. When everything finally quieted down and silence reigned around us, we gathered our strength and decided to leave the chapel. Looking around and ensuring that the immediate threat was gone, we chose to return to the car the same way we came. After traversing the forest, now looked upon with completely different emotions, we reached the car about an hour later. After starting it up, we left that place behind, leaving the chapel and the horrors we endured that night behind. On the way home in the car, a heavy atmosphere of mourning prevailed. We remembered our friends, Thomas and others who couldn't escape this nightmare with us. Sarah wept, mourning the loss, and we all shared in her grief. Tears were the only way to express all the pain and hopelessness we felt after what had happened. What we went through will forever remain with us as a reminder that the world is full of unexplored and sometimes dangerous secrets.
Story 3.
Whispering Pines is a secluded town in Alaska that seems to attract tourists with its mysterious legends of ghosts, spirits, cannibals, and unexplained phenomena. But what particularly intrigues the residents and guests is one rumor about the legendary vampire. It all started about a year ago when a 15-year-old girl disappeared. It was known only that she went for a walk around the town and never returned. 3 days later, she was found dead. She had no heart and no blood. There were no fingerprints or shoe prints at the crime scene. Only the girl's body. An expression of horror was frozen on her face, as if she could scream at any moment. But she was dead. Strangely, the parents withdrew their statement and asked to close the case. The funeral took place a few days later, and after that, people began to disappear. On the back seat of the pickup truck, a young man was sound asleep, about 18 years old. His name was Jack. Due to family circumstances, he had to move to this town, which didn't upset him at all. Firstly, he could finally live separately from his parents, who were so distraught about the separation from their son. Secondly, despite all doubts, his parents bought a decent-sized house here. Jack suggested staying with acquaintances, but his parents insisted on buying their own home. Thirdly, all these local legends and rumors lured him. Besides, he was going to spend a whole year here. No school, but with a job. Waking up, Jack saw a horrifying sight, blood and corpses everywhere. A severed part of a man's body was slowly crawling, leaving behind a bloody trail. Blinking, the boy saw a normal town, without all this bloody massacre. A soft female voice from the front seat finally brought him out of half-sleep. "Son, are you awake?" "Yeah," Jack barely squeezed out. "Here are your pills. They're in my bag." Finding them right away, Jack felt relief. The pills were his salvation from excruciating headaches and hallucinations, which he believed were part of reality. He couldn't understand why others didn't see it. Instead of people, he saw their true essence. And he often repeated, "There are no people, only monsters." He still had about an hour's drive ahead of him, but Jack couldn't fall asleep anymore. Taking out his phone, he checked the messages on social media and found one from his friend who lived in this town. "Hey Jack, right when you wake up. How many times have I asked you not to call me that? Oh, the fierce beast has awakened. Mike, I'm serious, I'll kill you. Angry predator, who will you talk to? With ghosts? Or with yourself, like in the good old days? Okay, let it be angry predator. And don't remind me of talking to myself. So tell me, what's going on over there? People disappearing, murders happening. Of course, I've gathered a lot of information. When you arrive, come over to my place, you know the address. You live nearby. Don't ask me how I know. How are you after that incident? Fine. Although no, I'm still going through it. But let's not talk about it, okay? I'm sorry, Predator. How much longer until we arrive? About another hour, cunning fox. Yuck. All right, what information do you have? Enough to keep you from falling asleep. You're starting to scare me. Oh, come on, don't be afraid. Okay, I'll text you when I'm heading over. Looking forward to it, angry predator. About half an hour passed when Jack heard the sound of a message notification. Hey Jack, remember how we summoned the astral spirit back then? I recently came across some information and wanted to share it with you. It seems that this spirit could have attached itself to you. If that's really the case, it will soon try to take over your body. Perhaps there's a way to banish it, although I'm not sure about the details yet. Probably we should discuss this in person when you arrive, haha. A pensive smile appeared on the boy's face. He began a quiet dialogue with himself, assuming that someone else might join the conversation. Does he really think the spirit didn't attach itself to anyone else? Perhaps it's for the best that doubts arose only now. But how do I distract his suspicions from me now? It's a difficult task, but solvable. Or maybe... At that moment, Jack involuntarily reached for the knife sheath. I could have a little fun. There was no twisted grin on his face now, just a friendly expression hiding a feral grin. Jack. Suddenly a voice rang out. Yes? He mentally replied. Drop your feral grin. It's just trying to find out if I attach myself to anyone else. And by the way, for some reason I can only control your body halfway. Disappointing, isn't it? Enough. Tell me instead, are you really the astral spirit? Maybe you're someone else? At that moment, Jack noticed the condensation on the windows and strange symbols appearing on them. Someday you'll decipher their meaning. But for now, it's better to rest, he thought. The next moment, the young man was already asleep. A room. White walls, black floor. Among all this, a dark cherry-colored armchair stood out. Everything seemed real, but at the same time so fake. Do you remember me? Do you remember that woman's body buried at the intersection? Do you remember the deal? Do you remember where you got that scar from? The voice whispered from afar and turned into a scream. A piercing scream that drives you crazy but doesn't let you wake up. And it's not just one voice. There are two of them. One whispers in the same tone. Do you remember those victims for me, who became just a game for you? Do you remember the knife that's now just a toy for you? All you want to do is plug your ears and scream, "Shut up, shut up, shut up." The second voice just screams. It screams and screams without stopping. Have you heard how mothers scream when they lose their children? Have you heard how fathers scream? Hearing such a scream hurts. It squeezes the heart. And this creature screams differently, tearing the ears, forcing them to shut. But the scream doesn't get quieter, only louder. You want to tear your ears off, but it abruptly stops. Jack, Jack. The boy wakes up closer to 3 in the afternoon. He's still in the car, but they're already near home. Apparently, they didn't wake him up. Grabbing his backpack, he gets out of the car. "Son, are you awake already? Sorry for not waking you up. You always fall asleep after taking the pills. Dad already took your things to your new room. All your pills are over there in that cupboard. And yes, son, please, don't put knives and ropes on top. Okay, anything else? Your father and I will be here for another day. And don't trespass on others' territory." "What are you talking about?" Jack understood perfectly well what she meant, as a smirk appeared on his face. "You know, there are rumors about some vampire, and we're just on the street where most people disappeared. Be more careful. Don't forget gloves, don't leave traces, check for cameras, and be careful." "Okay, Mommy. Will you show me where my room is?" The boy always played to the audience, even in front of his parents. His mother knew his secret, and he knew hers. A fake half-smile, emotions. His mother knew his secret, knew he was a psycho, but didn't betray him. Why? You might ask. The answer is simple. She herself was to blame for this. No, her son didn't blame her. He even said he was glad. But she didn't believe it, no. It can't be that she did such a thing. She wanted to sacrifice her own child to the devil, but it failed. And he survived. He was 5 years old. An innocent boy who told his parents every day how much he loved them, now resembled a puppet without a puppeteer. A puppet always seems alive, but there's no sparkle of life in its eyes. A puppet should stand behind the glass and attract with its appearance, and scare at the same time. But Jack was like a broken hinge doll. That's why the puppeteer threw her away. A broken doll can be fixed, but why bother when it will break again? A new doll, that's the replacement. "Yes, son, let's go. I'll show you your room. I want to remind you that you need to take other pills." A sad smile appeared on the mother's face. The room was on the second floor, the farthest one. The door to the room was pure white, almost too much so. It was annoying, although Jack couldn't disagree that it was beautiful. Neat patterns on painted oak. Why did they even paint it? The boy couldn't understand, but he didn't ask the question either. His mother went downstairs right after bringing him, so the boy could stand calmly and stroke the patterns. The boy snorted. It seemed like a light mockery of him, because he wasn't purely white. And only now did he realize why the door was painted. It started to rot, and they decided to hide it with all possible efforts. Now Jack found it simply amusing. He couldn't contain his laughter because now he thinks he's like this door, a neat shell that no one would dare to find flaws or imperfections behind. But as soon as you start peeling off the layers of paint, everything falls into place. Only now did the boy look at the door handle in the shape of a skull, around which a chain was wound. In the place of eye sockets, there was a green plastic gem. Smirking again, he gently pushed the door. With a barely audible creak, it opened. Honestly, he expected a small closet, but he was surprised. The room turned out to be large, no, even huge. Closing the door behind him, the The boy immediately began to inspect the room. His eyes immediately caught the dark cherry armchair, which neatly stood in the corner of the room, right where there were no wallpapers. He began to recall the dream, and a nervous tic started. His left eye began to twitch, and his left knee began to shake. No, he wasn't scared. He was just angry at this dumb spirit. Although he still doesn't know for sure what he's attached to. It's probably for the best. And only after a few minutes did he notice the plush toy. Plush death. What could be funnier and cuter? He noticed that the toy started to move. Haha, how cute. A scary creature in such a cute toy. I'd crush it like that. The boy approached the armchair, picked up the toy and raised it up. Put me back. You've become softer, haven't you? The boy only heard a snort in response. Put me back already. Shut up and don't move. You're useless anyway. Not only do you not help, but you keep yelling all the time. Or do you not get enough blood to change this body? The toy started to hiss and twitch with its bony hand. The boy could have continued to torment death, but he was distracted by the sound of a notification from his phone. The screen showed information. This surprised him. Apparently, it was too lazy to write in the social network. Opening the message, he began to read it. Jack, I don't know if you're alive there or not, but urgently run to my house. I found something. Don't reply to this message. Okay, not to reply, then I won't. Hey Death, get into the backpack. Let's go find some adventures together, and I'll still go take the pills. The boy disappeared behind the door. Bastard, but what about blood, okay? Getting into the backpack, then getting into the backpack, you juvenile monster. Right before the toy could finish its monologue, Jack burst into the room and closed the door. The boy was clearly running away from someone. Deciding to anger him even more, Death started talking to him. Master, what happened? You seem to have seen a ghost. Quiet. The boy tiptoed to the backpack. It's worse, it's... But the boy was immediately interrupted by a shout from behind the door. Scum, come out. We thought he'd been dead for years, but he's actually alive. Turns out he's a cowardly mouse. Male and female voices could be heard behind the door. The boy started whispering to the toy. You kinda needed blood, right? Let's do this. We either go out the window, or they tear us to pieces. And don't call me Master. As you wish. Yes, I needed blood. And if through the window, just don't say you'll jump. The toy hadn't finished speaking when it found itself in the backpack, with only its head sticking out. It's your job to protect my body, and yes, I'll be jumping. The ropes are somewhere down there. They appeared at the window before he could finish. If I injure myself in any way, you'll pay for it. After saying these words, the boy jumped out of the window. Before Jack's eyes, a picture began to blur, and then darkness enveloped him. It seemed eternal, but suddenly the picture returned to normal. His legs didn't hold him all that time when this creature took over his mind. It was impossible to move. Even thinking after that was impossible. However, this creature cannot take control of Jack's body forever. At most, for a few minutes, which annoyed the plush death. Jack dragged his feet, barely managing to come to his senses. The picture still occasionally swam before his eyes. From the outside, he looked like a drugged or drunken teenager. During the half hour that Jack walked, he nearly got lost 3 times, but he didn't because he remembered the way. Because on the side where his house was, a dense and dark forest was a few kilometers away. Guys used to go there often. Even in those days when Jack only came here for autumn and spring vacations. Their first meeting wasn't the most pleasant for him. Why? And now, imagine, you don't bother anyone, sit quietly on a fallen tree, reading a book, And then someone starts pestering you with questions according to the plan. Why are you alone here? Where did you get that scar? What are you reading? How old are you? Why are you silent? Why is the iris of one eye red? And after a couple of minutes of such a barrage of questions, you just give up and start answering, and you yourself don't notice how the dialogue begins. A few days later, you're leaving, and the guy just gives you his email. A few years later, he's your best friend who will tear your head off if you don't answer his messages. Thinking about that, Jack realized that he was starting to smile, something the boy couldn't do. A genuine smile. That's what he couldn't do. Fake smiles without feelings, fake joy, fake emotions. Jack realized that he was starting to think about unnecessary things again. So he shook his head and just kept walking. He had another 20 minutes to go. Jack would have taken out his headphones, but he understood perfectly well that death would immediately try to talk to him, and right now he just wanted to get there faster. A call. The phone screen once again displayed information. Hey, Predator, you're probably already on your way. I wanted to say, as far as I remember, you're not a fan of big companies, but it's not my fault. They came by themselves. There's the one you're more or less familiar with. And there are new people. Sly fox. All right, I'll endure it this time, but about... No one will see the folders with information. Mike cut him off in a whisper. Yeah, okay. We'll talk later. Jack didn't wait for a response and ended the call, sighing heavily. As soon as the boy put the phone in his jeans pocket, someone knocked him off his feet. What the... Oh, sorry. I'm in a hurry and didn't notice you. I apologize again. Jack didn't say anything, but simply started getting up from the asphalt. And only now did he look at the person who had knocked him down. But all he saw were the eyes. It seemed like there was no iris in them, only a dark gray outline indicating the presence of an iris. Jack was overwhelmed by the urge to squeeze those eyes out, to watch warm blood like silk enveloping his fingers, to see eyeballs oozing out of their sockets, to witness the body convulsing. It took Jack several minutes to break away from these thoughts, realizing he was still lying on the asphalt. Quickly getting up, he decided to continue on to Mike's house. After all, he still had about 20 minutes to go. The rest of the way, Jack didn't encounter any strange situations and didn't seek adventure himself. If necessary, they would find him on their own. Or maybe they had already found him and were waiting for the right moment to happen. There wasn't much left until Mike's house. But who said nothing would happen? Indeed, no one. Darkness engulfed his vision again. It seemed like an eternity passed. Nothing was visible. Only the sound of the wind, mixed with human cries for help, the ring of bullets falling to the ground, the crunch of breaking bones, and someone whispering directly into his ear. Do you hear this? I'm to blame for all of this. Do you hear these prayers? I made them recite them. Do you hear this crying? I brought them to this. It's a beautiful serenade in my honor. Listen carefully. Listen, listen, listen. The last word was screamed into Jack's ear, after which the previous scene returned before his eyes. Nothing had happened. Everything remained the same. Someone asked if he was okay. Only now did he realize he had fallen to his knees. Without a word, Jack got up and headed to his friend's house, as he had fallen just a few meters short of it. Already standing at the door, Jack brushed off the dust from his feet, put on a silly smile, and tried to look more cheerful. As soon as he knocked on the door, it almost slammed into him. Before him stood a perpetually smiling guy with bright orange hair. The wicked predator is back. Let us rejoice. Ha ha. Tell me, how many people are approximately in the house? Just as you hate, probably more than a dozen. Jack nervously chuckled and closed his left eye, suspecting there would be inquiries, but at least they would just stare. How bad is it in there? Well, You'll see for yourself. And remember, I wrote to you about the astral spirit? Let's talk about that later when there aren't any people around." After these words, Jack entered the house. Nothing had changed except that now people were having a great time in the living room. So many fake emotions, so much pretense. Every time Jack blinked, the people disappeared, replaced by monsters. Twisted legs, long teeth sticking out in different directions. Instead of heads, skulls that resembled cat skulls more than anything. The teeth clicked disgustingly with every word spoken. The bodies were bent into an inverted S shape. These creatures, as Jack thought, looked better than those idiots. Bloody masses occasionally dripped from their eye sockets. It was impossible to call it blood. It seemed like organs blended in a blender were flowing down their skulls. A voice echoed in his head. A voice he had heard before. "They're not praying. It saddens me. They're not in pain. They're not suffering. But do you see and hear them? Is it true? Are they repulsive? Do you really want to break their necks? Drink their blood to the last drop? But to whom exactly? To humans or to these creatures? Come on, Jack, tell me the truth and only that." The answer burst out of Jack's mouth on its own. "To humans. What's wrong with you?" The guy shook his head and fake smiled. "Sorry, lost in thought. The atmosphere here is just unfamiliar to me." Jack's hands began to tremble with the desire to strangle people and see tears pouring from their eyes, to sink his teeth into them and drink their blood, to see their mouths opening and closing in an attempt to grasp for air, like a fish out of water. "Sorry again. Can I use the bathroom?" "Sure, well, I guess you remember where it is. Are you sure everything's okay with you?" "I'm perfectly fine," shouted the guy, climbing up the stairs. Entering the bathroom, Jack immediately locked the door and slid down. His hands trembled more violently and he couldn't control them. An ugly grin spread across his face. His pupils narrowed at once. The thirst for blood could easily win this battle. Black spots danced before his eyes. His heart pounded furiously, as if it were drowning in its own blood and was about to burst. All this time, the spirit tried to communicate with him mentally, but in vain. He had seen Jack in such a state before. If he waited just a little longer, the guy's brain would shut down, and his body would follow the bloody desire. At such moments, seizing control of the boy's body was impossible, even for those pathetic few minutes. Jack's consciousness was foggy. To stand up and walk to the sink, that was his goal for these few minutes. On weak legs, the guy crawled roughly to the sink to turn on the cold water and stick his head under the tap. "This won't help anyway," he told himself. The trembling in his hands became less noticeable. The grin only worsened, and he slowly slipped into an ugly, insane smile. The backpack lay by the door, the plush toy still protruding from it. The guy turned off the tap, but didn't lift his head. "You still need blood, huh? Hey, right?" The guy's voice trembled. His hands were on the sink, gripping its corners. "Correct," the voice sounded in his head. "You know what to do, Jack, you know." The guy, still not raising his head, took out a knife from the sink. Only now did he raise his head. Putting the knife in the sink, he began to take off the glove from his left hand. Now you could see his palm. It was disfigured by a burn from the wrist to the tips of his fingers. "You know, I hope the acoustics here are bad." After these words, Jack grabbed the knife from the sink and cut the skin on his palm. A trickle of blood slowly flowed from the incision. Several drops of crimson liquid fell into the sink. After a few seconds, the guy felt a sharp pain, as if all his organs were being sucked out through the cut. He wanted to scream, but he was just seized by a spasm. He knew it wouldn't last long. He had never seen what or how blood was consumed. It always happened the same way. A cut, sharp pain, and then for some time it was impossible to move the hand. Rinsing the knife under the tap, he sheathed it, grabbed his backpack, and left the bathroom. Descending the stairs, the guy entered the living room, never opening his left eye. Everyone was discussing something animatedly. Jack occasionally heard summoning, death, corpse. These words were repeated most often. As soon as he crossed the threshold, people began to look at him with curiosity. Some genuinely looked interested, some looked down on him, and some tried to incinerate him with their gaze. Mike appeared next to Jack. "Everyone shut up. Thanks. I told you, if one psycho comes, it's him. This is Jack." Surprisingly, everyone greeted him simultaneously. It reminded Jack of an AA meeting. Yes, I'm his supervisor for today. Speaking of which, he's not sociable, he's angry. Don't ask him too many questions. What else? Oh, right. Could someone bring a chair?" At this moment, Jack shook his head negatively. "Got it? No need for a chair." Everyone started discussing something incomprehensible again. Jack just sat on the floor next to the couch, putting his backpack between his legs, and began to study the people. Everyone wanted to put in their 2 cents. It all resembled a kindergarten. They argued like children whose toy was better, whose version of this or that legend was better. Everything was going calmly until they turned to him with a few questions. "Hey, Jack," or whatever your name is, "whose version do you think is better?" He didn't want to answer, but they were looking at him, waiting for a response. "I'm sorry, but it's the same legend. The only difference is that here the character is called this, and there that. Here everyone dies, and there one character remains telling everything to a psychiatrist. Although, there is a difference, but the end is always the same. Evil doesn't die. Never. It just changes its appearance, changes its names." After these words, silence fell in the room. Everyone wanted to hear what would be said next. "All these stories you've told are just another dumb slasher, where there's a maniac who's probably crazy and wears a mask, kills a group of teenagers in the woods or at a party, and no one survives, not even the maniac. Everyone's dead, happy end. But no, it turns out the maniac survived and will return in a new guise and with a new name." After these words, Jack sighed heavily. "You asked for my opinion, and I answered. Carry on with your argument." And the argument continued, but about another legend. Analyzing people was a fun activity for Jack. He didn't even notice how he opened his left eye. Now everything was going more or less calmly. An hour of peace ended when someone suggested, "Let's summon the astral spirit." Jack and Mike were shocked. "I'll answer your questions right away. This is interesting, and there's someone here who suggested it. And it's getting really boring here." "Sorry, but wouldn't it be better to start with something simpler?" Jack pondered whether to engage in the conversation. "Are you really scared? It's just fiction." Once again, silence fell in the living room. It didn't last long, as Jack decided to break it. "Summoning the astral spirit is stupid and a waste of time. If you think it'll show up, you're dumb. And if it does show up, why are you so sure it'll attach itself to you? And if it does, do you know what all this will lead to? I understand it's too hard for you to grasp, but I'll tell you one thing." Jack formed his fingers into the shape of a gun and pointed it at the girl. Bang! "You'll die, maybe not even making it to 21. And if you're bored, why not just leave? I guess I got carried away." The girl didn't say anything in response. She just glared at Jack with anger, and he knew what he would be doing tonight. As it approached 9 in the evening, people began to disperse. There weren't many left in the house. All Jack could think about was that he would check the information tomorrow, and it wouldn't be bad to keep an eye on the girl who had put on such a grand show tonight. Jack couldn't understand why specifically the astral spirit. His musings were interrupted by a sharp clap on the back. "Predator, stop killing everyone with your gaze." Jack didn't reply. He just stopped surveying the surroundings. But he had a few questions for Mike. However, there was no time to ask them. The girl started to gather her things quickly. "Sorry, Mike. I have other things to do," she yelled and slammed the door. Jack took out his phone. No missed calls, no messages, not even notifications from the operator. He could pretend they were there. "Mike, sorry, I have to run," he shouted, grabbing his backpack. "I'll drop by tomorrow if you don't mind." "Yeah, sure, see you." Jack flew out of the house into the night. The bright light of the street lamps made him open his eyes. The girl found herself in the basement of her house. How did she end up here? And what was that shadow in the corner? Trying to stand up proved unsuccessful. Making sounds was terrifying. "Are you awake already?" The voice seemed familiar. "It wasn't that hard to find out where you live." Another attempt to get up failed. "Right. I taped your mouth shut. You can scream, but no one will come." With each word, the girl trembled more and more. She couldn't see what was behind her or who was standing there, and she didn't want to see. A hand rested on her shoulder, while another ripped off the tape. A half scream escaped from under the tape. The girl was suddenly turned around, and she saw her family alive, her brother, mother, father. They had wounds on their bodies, tears streaming from their eyes. They were trembling. "You're a psycho. Why are you doing this? Why?" The girl tried to jerk away in her chair. "You're a monster." Jack laughed, standing before her. His face bore a crazed smile, one eye twitching, his face covered in blood. "Jack, have you gone mad?" Tears streamed down the girl's face. "Why my family? Why me?" Jack waved his index finger and pressed it to his lips. "Shh, quieter. It's very simple. I don't like you," he shrugged. "But I won't explain for long. It's time to get down to business." Jack pulled out a knife and began flipping it from hand to hand as he approached the girl. "Who first? What do you say?" The girl's eyes widened in horror. "We're all going to die anyway, aren't we?" she asked. "Absolutely right." Jack went to the shelf, grabbed a drill. "Let's see if it's loaded." "Oh yes, it is." Jack approached her brother, turned on the drill. Its sound caused panic in the entire family. They were all tied up, unable to help. "Time to have some fun," Jack said darkly, ignoring pleas and cries. Every step he took was filled with a thirst for blood and madness. He was the artist of his dark art, painting his horrific pictures on the walls with blood while the family watched helplessly, witnessing his madness. The end of that terrible night was as grim as its beginning. A week later, Jack woke up on the floor once again, finding it more comfortable than his bed. The sound of the door slamming could be heard. Footsteps echoed. It didn't bother him. He knew who it was. What bothered him was where the hell his phone was. Getting up from the floor, he staggered into the bathroom. Once again, the mirror reflected a semblance of a human, but not quite. Bags under his eyes, a hazy gaze, stitches on his face that should have been removed long ago as they could get infected, but it had been a month. The wounds had healed, but the stitches remained, though they looked decent. Black leather gloves lay again on the corner of the sink. Burns and scars on his hands itched disgustingly, flaking off. Several years had passed, but they still looked repulsive. Sometimes he wanted to take a grater and rub his hands on it, feel the hellish pain, watch the blood flow, watch as the skin on his hands turned into an incomprehensible consistency. The world's a fake, but pain reveals the truth. Having finished his business, the guy went downstairs, where a boy about 12 years old was pacing back and forth. "Harry, aren't you looking for this?" Jack spun a black medical mask in his hands. The boy snatched the mask, hissed something viciously, and went to the kitchen. "Jack, your phone is in the kitchen on the table," he shouted without apparent reason, standing in the doorway himself. As soon as the boy in the medical mask noticed him, he quickly left. Jack simply picked up the phone and was slightly surprised. It was Sunday, 6:30 in the morning. Too early, he thought, but the call from an unknown number didn't seem to agree. For the first couple of seconds there was silence. Then a hissing sound followed, and only after that did a distorted voice speak. I found you. Come. To the forest. You're just like me." Cool, Jack thought. Initially, he wanted to say something in response, but his whole body screamed that he needed coffee, and he needed it urgently. So he just declined the call. In the kitchen, he tried not to make too much noise, as he'd likely get hit with a pillow or 2 or 3. The cup of coffee he prepared was sitting on the table, slowly cooling down. The steam rising from it was mesmerizing, spreading a sickly, sweet scent throughout the kitchen. Jack turned the chair around, facing it towards the table, and sat down. He didn't know why, but it just felt comfortable to sit this way. Placing his hands on the table and his head on them, he enjoyed the silence. Silence always spoke more than noise. However, his phone kept buzzing persistently with incoming messages. It was from the same unknown number, and the messages contained time and location details for a meeting. Jack read them and turned off the phone. Just then, someone began knocking insistently on the door. Having coffee on a Sunday morning is apparently impossible, he thought, as the knocking stopped. It seemed strange, but Jack decided to pretend he hadn't heard anything. Silence returned to the house, and the coffee had already gone cold. The time had come. The night was dark, and the stars barely peeked through the clouds. Jack left the house and headed towards the forest, which began behind his backyard. "I'll spill someone's guts if this turns out to be one of Mike's pranks," he mused, causing a headache. Jack walked quickly, ignoring the rustling of leaves under his feet and branches scratching his face. His thoughts were focused on the upcoming meeting. What if it's a trap? Crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. When he reached the clearing where the meeting was supposed to take place, Jack stopped and looked around. The night had swallowed everything, leaving him alone with uncertainty. A soft hissing sound caught his attention, coming from his backpack. He slowly pulled out an old, worn-out toy. The plush death whispered, "I sense. He's approaching, Master of the Night." Jack tightened his grip on the toy. "Got it. We'll wait," he replied quietly, surveying the dark clearing. A figure appeared in the distance. It was the Master of the Night, the embodiment of all the fears Jack had ever encountered in this dark forest. It was a legendary vampire, dressed in ordinary clothes, a jacket and jeans. Jack stepped forward, approaching the dark figure, which stood motionless among the trees. The vampire's face was impassive, but his eyes burned with cold fire. Jack recognized those eyes. He had encountered them before when the owner of those eyes had pushed him, knocking him to the ground. "You're noisy, out of control, and that nasty spirit with you," the vampire said, his voice barely breaking the night's silence. Jack silently assessed the situation. "Too many traces you need to clean up after yourself, boy, or they'll catch you soon," the vampire continued. "Sometimes I feel like being chased will add some spice to the game," Jack replied with a hint of irony in his voice. But there was a threat behind it. The vampire tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating Jack from a new perspective. "We both know this town is too small for the two of us. There's only room for one predator here. I'm convinced it's not you." Jack nodded, realizing that arguing was futile. Deep down, he knew the vampire was right. But his fits, his thirst, were much stronger than Jack himself. The ghost remained suspiciously silent, not even flinching when insulted. "You're scared, aren't you, Plush Death?" Jack thought. "That's funny." "Understood. But am I capable of sitting idle?" "And what should we do?" Jack asked. The vampire didn't answer his question. He turned around and as he walked away, added, "You will die." Jack stood alone in the night, pondering the vampire's words. He knew he didn't have much time left to live, but before that, he wanted to have fun and let off some steam. Now that he knew his end was predetermined, he didn't want to limit himself. Jack remembered his friend Mike. "Well, it's time to dive into unrestrained fun.